It's my great pleasure to introduce Kate Hampton, who is the Community Preservation Historian at the Montana Historical Society State Historic Preservation Office. She is also the director of the Identifying African American Heritage Resources in Montana's project, which documents resources and places throughout the state associated with Black history. And she served as executive producer and co-writer of the documentary, Hidden Stories, Montana's Black Past, which I'm delighted to tell you is going to be airing on Montana PBS this coming Monday, February 13th at 8 p.m. So, with no further ado, Kate Hampton.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Oh, good. So yes, I am Kate Hampton, and I've worked at the Historical Society since the year 2000. And I, before that, worked in Missoula for a little while, but I always open all of my talks with the understanding that I was not born in Montana, and that's okay. And, but I moved here in 1993 for grad school. And the story of my travel is just kind of a fun little anecdote. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, so if I fall into my Baltimore accent, which I do sometimes when I'm very nervous, you'll know that I'm getting very nervous if I start talking like a Baltimorean and saying, yeah, hon, okay. But when I was in the 7th grade, you know, you have to pick a state and do a report on it. And I was absent that day, the day they picked the state names. And the only thing that was left was Idaho and Montana. And I picked the Montana and looked at the Time Life book, you know, on the Continental Divide and learned everything I needed to know about Montana. And then threatened my family. Whenever my mom and dad, I was mad at them, I would say, you see, I'm going to pick up and I'm going to move to Montana one day and you'll be sorry, which I did in the early 90s. So I've been here ever since. And then my other little story about how I got into Black history in Montana in particular was when I first started my job with the Montana Historical Society, I ran the National Register program for the state. And I was visiting Great Falls, Montana, at kind of a tourism breakfast lunch kind of conference. And a gentleman grabbed me by the elbow, I've never met him before in my life, and said, I need you to come with me. There's an important place that you have to see. I don't suggest this for small children or anybody really, but I got in the car with him and I was like, sure, show me what place you want to show me. And we ended up at the AME Church in Great Falls, the Union Bethel African Methodist Church. And that gentleman's name is Frank G., and he and his wife Mary were trying to save the church. They had a wonderful congregation of tens and maybe 100, 200 people at one point, and they were dwindled down to 6 people. And they said, this place is really important and we need to save it. And they got a great pastor from the Malmstrom Air Force Base. His name was Major Payne. I'm not kidding, his name was Major Payne. And he was just dynamic and wonderful. And they managed to place the church on the National Register of Historic Places. They got grants and local people to work on fixing the stairs and making it usable again. And now it's a church that welcomes everybody from multiple denominations and ethnicities and is a going concern again. And so just knowing Mr. G and the rest of those folks really inspired me to kind of keep going with this project. And then a few years later, Mr. Bob Harris, also from Great Falls, came down to the Historical Society with Ken Robison and said, they're going to open a Smithsonian History Museum on African American history. This is about 2006. And he said, Montana has to be a part of it. How are we going to do that? And so the documenting and identifying Montana's African American Heritage Resources Project was born. And so we've been doing this for 16, 17 years now, just this kind of stuff in particular. And one of the projects is, you know, we've built a website, we did all kinds of stuff, but one of the things I found most fascinating is kind of the history of legislation, the history of the laws that Montana specifically passed that affected African American people in particular. And sometimes it discriminated against them. Sometimes those laws and policies were discriminatory policies, and sometimes it was protections too. So this evening I hope to go through some of them and just raise a little bit of awareness about the history, this aspect, kind of the legal Black history of Montana. So I hope it's okay with you. And there's some scandals in the middle, which makes it really exciting. It's not just a dry talk that, Genesis, this begat this, begat this. So hopefully it's a little bit more exciting than that. But I am going to read a little, so I don't miss anything. And I'll say, since the time of Lewis and Clark, African Americans have played a significant part in shaping the state's cultural landscape. Unfortunately, most of our history books, essays, and articles fail to acknowledge the influences upon and influences of Montana's Black past. Not only is it important to understand the role African American people have had and continue to have in the state's social, political, and commercial development, but also how local, statewide, and national events, laws, and policies informed those experiences. So this presentation, as I said, will introduce the history of several Montana laws that affected how African American residents were able to participate in society. Since the establishment of the Montana Territory in 1864 through the present day, Montana has enforced laws and policies designed to address, sometimes to limit and sometimes to protect, the rights of minority populations. State and local authorities codified and regulated discriminatory policies in regard to members of the state's Black, Native American, Chinese, and Japanese communities. Today I'll provide an overview of some of those legal and regulatory acts that affected African Americans in particular. And I have to acknowledge, let's see if I can get this to work, a couple of people along the way. I'm indebted to Glenda, Rose, Spearman, Eruchea, who researched, compiled, and contextualized these laws for her master's thesis in the Political Science Department at the University of Montana in 1981. J. Smur's Jim Crow Out West, published in 1957, is an incredibly important and groundbreaking scholarship that, until my friend Anthony Wood published Black Montana last year, was the authority on legal aspects of Montana's discriminatory laws. Anthony Wood, who worked with us on this project at the Historical Society and has gone on to great and wonderful things, actually did publish a book called Montana's Black Past, or Black Montana, and it's available, and I strongly suggest if you're interested in Montana history in general, if you pick that one up. It offers a whole new perspective, exhaustive research, and invaluable insight. So to understand the beginning of Montana's legal history, it's important to know how the Montana Territory developed. Montana Territory was carved from Idaho Territory in 1864. Idaho Territory had been established just the year before in 1863. Congress carved it from the eastern portion of Washington Territory and the western portions of Dakota Territory and Nebraska Territory. So if we look up here, I'm going to point, you can see where Washington Territory kind of included all of what is now Idaho. Nebraska Territory is down here in the little bit down near in most of Wyoming, and Dakota Territory went all the way over to the Continental Divide. So that's generally where things stood in 1861. So very dynamic time, right? 1860s, a lot's going on in the country, including all of this kind of territorial divvying up. In 1863, Idaho Territory included everything that is now Idaho, plus this little state, which was a little state and county within Idaho in 1863. And then they grabbed some of Dakota Territory and Nebraska Territory as well. So that by 1863, you had these 6 huge counties in Idaho Territory. So when Montana Territory was established in 1864, we all know the famous story, right, that people didn't understand which ridge line was actually the Continental Divide. And so the state line was actually drawn where it is today instead of the actual Continental Divide like they meant to. because people in Washington just didn't understand geography. So that's how we got our shape today. So a lot of dynamic things are going on, and suddenly we're our own territory, right? And we have to come up with our own laws. And so the easiest way to do that is to copy somebody else's, right? If it's not broken, don't fix it, in their mind. So they just adopted essentially Idaho's laws, territorial laws. They adopted that at the first legislature, and it became their framework for Montana laws moving forward. And one of those laws was especially good, and let's start with a relatively positive example on our journey here tonight. And that is, as in Idaho, Montana Territory did not allow people to be taken from the state to enslave them, so that's good, right? We like that, so that's a really good start. No slavery in the state and no taking people away to enslave them in other places. This law established that, quote, every person who shall forcibly steal, take, or arrest a man, woman, or child, either white or colored, or any Indian, because you have to separate them out in their discussion, in this territory, and carry him or her into another county, state, or territory, or who shall forcibly take or arrest any person or persons whatsoever with the design to take him or her out of this territory without having established a claim according to the laws of the United States, shall, upon conviction, be deemed guilty of kidnapping. The law carried a penalty of no less than 1 year, but no more than 10 years in prison for each offense. But you have to notice the caveat, right? It isn't just no slavery. It's all of this explanation, including, quote, without having established a claim according to the laws of the United States. So a little background on that. In the summer of 1862, Congress took the following actions regarding slavery. They said, they abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and the federal territories. So that's great. That's us out here. Authorized the confiscation of slaves owned by Confederates, formally freed all slaves who had escaped the the United States Army, prohibited the Army from returning fugitive slaves, authorized the enlistment of black soldiers, and created public schools for African American children in the District of Columbia. So that all happened in 1862. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, declaring that, quote, all persons held as slaves, unquote, within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free. While the federal Fugitive Slave Acts were repealed in June of 1864, Montana's first legislature kept this language, this kind of unless federal law says otherwise, to allow for the possibility of other federal laws coming into play. So if the people in DC changed their mind, they would be able to change their mind too. Notably, in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. And this is important, except for punishment for a crime. That exception remains on the books today. Though there have been recent movements to drop that exception, Colorado in 2018, Utah and Nebraska in 2020. In Montana, as in other states, that exception, still on the books, that servitude may be required as a punishment for crime, has been used to defend the use of prison labor, like chain gangs. So they don't necessarily want to get rid of that little caveat, right? Back to the first territorial legislature, we find that Montana territorial law had a lot to say about who and who could not vote. It was pretty straightforward. Only white male citizens over 20 years and older could vote in federal, territorial, and local political elections. The law also restricted school district votes to, quote, every white male inhabitant over the age of 21 years who shall have paid or be liable to pay any district tax shall be a legal voter at any school meeting. Just to be sure, they added, quote, and no other person shall be allowed to vote. This limitation will come into play when we discuss school segregation in a little bit. Congress considered and sent the 14th Amendment to be ratified by the states in 1866. The amendment not only recognized African Americans as citizens, but also said that states could not abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the laws. By 1867, the first Reconstruction Act required former Confederate states to allow African American men to vote. And the same year, Congress passed the Territorial Suffrage Act, giving black men in the territories the right to vote. So that kind of trumps the state law that says only white men, right? Now there's a federal law. It's part of the Constitution because it's an amendment that, and especially the Territorial Act allowed black voters in Montana. So the city of Helena, our very own here, fine city of Helena, experimented with African American voting in their 1867 election. And members of the local Republican Party encouraged black people to go to the polls. However, local Democrats and white bullies intimidated and threatened violence toward prospective voters. An Irish rioter murdered Sammy Hayes in the melee, and according to historian Mr. Smur, the marshal had to fight his way through a hostile crowd when taking the man to the courthouse. And a little bit more in depth on that story. So I found a kind of accounting of it. There's some newspaper accounts and there's kind of a narrative account that was written a couple of years later. And so one of the stories kind of lionizes and makes vigilante X Beadler, who is a vigilante from Virginia City who was serving as a sheriff and marshal here in Helena at the time, as really the hero of the story. So let's see what you guys think. So this is quoting from that recollection. Election day came when the Negroes, for the first time in our history, were to exercise the right of suffrage. It was a great day for them. The few that were in the city soon began to make their appearance, dressed up for the occasion as for a holiday. And I'd like to put an aside, I dress up to vote because I think it's so fun and it's such a great, it is a holiday, right? And we should all dress up to vote because it's a really important day. So a riot was anticipated as threats had been made by the roughs in town that the Negroes should not vote without a fight. Helena Sheriff X Beadler stood near the polls to preserve the peace, to see that every man, black or white, was protected in voting. In the meantime, a colored barber and his Negro associate, these are men named George Washington and Samuel Hayes, had a set to fisticuffs to decide some knotty points of politics. The crowd arrested the combatants, the crowd, not the sheriff. And the newspaper article actually indicated that while they were scuffling and trying to arrest them, this crowd, they yelled to hang them. And the crowd rushed toward the men. And while conducting them to the magistrate, or really is it the lynching tree, the barber escaped and ran home. Hayes, still in their custody, was roughly charged by one John Leach with having drawn a pistol upon a white man. He said, according to the newspaper, "You black SOB, you drew a pistol on a white man, didn't you?" "You lie if you said that," said the indignant Hayes. "Did you call me a liar?" retorted Leach. "Yes, and any other man who says I drew a pistol or carry one." As he said this, the crowd released Hayes and he walked down to the street to the barber shop, but he was followed by Leach, who seized him by the collar with one hand and drawing and cocking a pistol with the other, repeated the question, "You drew a pistol upon a white man, didn't you?" Hayes again replied in the negative, and raising his arm said, "Search me if you think I have any weapons. My fuss was with the colored man, not with you. I don't want anything to do with you." As he turned to release himself from the grip of Leach, the ruffian, aiming at his heart, said, "If you open your mouth again, I'll kill you," and instantly fired, the ball entering his left side below the breast. Hayes lived about an hour. On being appraised of the affray, Mr. Beadler hastened to the spot to arrest Leach. A crowd of roughs stood around to protect Leach, But Beadler, pistol in hand and at risk of his life, pushed his way through it and led him to jail. So, you know what, you want to know what happened to Mr. Leach, right? I mean, did he get his just desserts? And I'm sorry to say he didn't. So he was jailed, and he was awaiting trial. And so this happened in September of 1867, and he's still waiting for a trial in February of 1868, when he and 2 others escaped and ran away from the jail, and to my knowledge, were never found. I never found their name again in the newspaper. I don't think he ever, so he got away with it. Rotten guy. But that was an aside. But back to our story. So in 1867, the state code, oh, this is Beadler, by the way. And then this is just 1860s Helena. So just an idea of the kind of streets where all of this was going on. So in 1867, the state codes confirmed that only white men could vote legally in Montana. The 1867 law, so this is later, a little bit later, also confirmed that chain gangs were legal, even at the local level. Forced labor prisoners could be punished with solitary confinement and limited to bread and water if they refused. The 14th Amendment granted black people citizenship in 1868, but as it turned out, it did not guarantee suffrage. That would have to wait until the 15th Amendment's ratification in 1870. And in Montana, the 1871-1872 code, the laws, extended voting rights to all male citizens. As elsewhere in the U.S., incidents of voter intimidation and suppression continued, and continue today, to plague Montana. The 1864 territorial laws also enumerate restrictions of African Americans' ability to participate in legal proceedings. To help everyone understand exactly who was who, the law also defined mulatto people as those who, quote, shall have 1/8 part or more of Negro blood, and every person who shall have 1/2 Indian blood shall be deemed an Indian, unquote. African Americans, Chinese, and Native American residents of the state could not testify at trials involving white litigants. They could, however, provide witness accounts in trials involving members of their own race. While the restrictions on witnesses disappeared from the Montana codes in 1871-72, the legislature retained the law that provided only white men could serve as jurors and serve summons. So while the witness ban was lifted, it was still illegal for anybody except white people to serve on juries. So the 14th and 15th Amendments ushered in a wave of legal revisions, and as we've seen, at least on the surface, the 1871-72 Montana territorial codes repealed its restrictions on African Americans' participation in voting and legal proceedings. However, as some rights were established, others were taken away. In 1872, Montana passed a new school segregation law. Here I borrow from Delia Hagen and Barbara Behan. What became known as the Segregation Bill was initially introduced in 1872 in the House by a representative originally from New York State, Dan Searles. And the leading Republican newspaper, the Herald of Helena, supported the bill from the first. When the bill, which provided for segregation of black school children, was considered in council, Granville Stewart, we all know he's a legend in Montana history, right? But he had an indigenous wife and children. So that meant that his kids couldn't attend school, their own school. So he didn't like that. And so he was able to speak up a little bit. And he amended the House bill, but did not alter the section on segregation. He just took Native American out of it. For the most part, debates over the bill reflected the legislature's shared anti-black racism and seemed to center on practical or legal issues rather than moral ones. When it came to legal authority, it was argued that the 14th Amendment of 1868 didn't apply to the territories. So a territory could legislate stringently against non-whites, they said. But legislating segregation and putting it up into consistent practice were two different things. Almost nowhere in the territory was it, quote, financially practical to have two public schools, and there was considerable controversy over whether and how to educate the few African American children in several towns. The bill stipulated that the education of children of African descent, quote, shall be provided for in separate schools. Modeled on a California bill passed 2 years earlier, the bill allowed Montana school districts to build separate schools whenever they had more than 10 African American children. Notably, California's law codified segregation practices that had existed in their state since at least 1866, while Montana was depriving Black people the rights they had formerly enjoyed. Right? They were able to go to school, and all of a sudden they weren't able to go to school. And the law said if you had 10 children, that you had to build them a school, but it didn't require you, in fact, it banned you from having 9 kids attend the same school as white children. So for the families that didn't have multiple, or towns where there weren't multiple families, the families were there, suffered a lot. So I'm going to talk about Helena again. Good old Helena keeps coming up. So school officials wasted no time in trying to purge the few Black children from the classrooms in their jurisdiction. In Deer Lodge, where the previous census, quote, showed only 15 colored residents, unquote, in the entire county, America Turner soon received notice from Granville Stewart and fellow school district directors that her son, quote, was not entitled to a place in the public school and he will not be admitted. Despite the teachers' protests at the student's dismissal, Granville Stewart, whose Native American children attended the same school, Stewart and his ilk prevailed, and the child was kicked out of school. In other towns, too, purged Black children from their primary schools. Virginia City, quote, had a short-lived separate schooling arrangement, as did Fort Benton. And in Fort Benton, a Black school was reportedly opened in 1878, but it apparently closed by 1882. Thereafter, quote, a conflict arose over the enrollment of a handful of Black children in the public school for whites. 4 white families withdrew their children when 2 girls of partial African American descent were admitted to the school. Similar events unfolded in White Sulphur Springs, where the city's 4 African American children were denied entry to the local school. The effort to segregate schools under the 1872 legislation, however, reached its fullest expression right here in Helena, the territorial capital and home of the largest African American community in the territory. Helena became ground zero for the early fight over school segregation in Montana Territory. In 1875, Helena's African American community contained about 19 school-aged children. That year, some of these children's parents attempted to enroll them in the Hill Street School. If you're trying to remember where Hill Street is, it doesn't exist anymore. And so I thought I'd pull up a couple of maps to help you guys understand where we are. So this is actually very close to where we're standing right now. Right here on the other side of Anchor Park, the other side of Cruz Avenue was Hill Street. And that's where the school was, and I'll show you a map in a minute. So the Black community immediately began protesting the exclusion of its children because that neighborhood, this neighborhood where we're standing right now, was a very diverse neighborhood with African American schools, or businesses and homes, Chinese community, and of course now it's gone. Because what do you tear down during urban renewal? You tear down the poor folks' homes, right? So this has kind of all been erased physically. A lot of it has been physically erased from the city of Helena, including the Hill Street School. So the Black community immediately began protesting the exclusion of its children. In 1876, 106 Helena Black and white residents submitted one of the many petitions to the Montana legislature to repeal the school segregation law. School segregation, the petitioners argued, was unnecessary and effectively barred Black children from an education. The House Education Committee rejected the petition. The protests of the Black community and its allies fell on deaf ears, and the school segregation law and Helena's segregated South Side School, they actually did have a separate school here, remained in place. I haven't been able to figure out exactly where the South Side School is. I've looked at all the Sanborn maps. I've really tried. I've got different ideas. There might have been over on Spencer Street, but it was certainly in this neighborhood. I just can't quite pinpoint its exact location. And so I haven't been able to figure that out, but you can see the Hillside School here is this little brick building. It says school and dwelling. And it was close, like I said, in that Black and Chinese neighborhood. So to give you an idea of where we are, this is an old Sanborn map from 1884. And so what we saw before was a close-up. And so here's our school right here, just to orient you a little bit. And here's the fire tower. And of course, the creek that used to run down. And then here's, I've kind of superimposed it. So essentially, this is north, right? We're standing right here, or sitting right here. I'm standing, you're sitting. Here's the fire tower, and the school's down here. So it was this neighborhood that we're talking about where there were enough African-American children to warrant their own school, right? But you know now, so much of this, Cruz Avenue pretty much took out most of this neighborhood. So I didn't find reference to a segregated school in Butte, even though they did have a pretty substantial African-American population. The 1870 census, however, places only one Black man living in Butte. But by 1880, the Bruce family's 4 children, the Johnsons 5, and the Johnsons, and altogether satisfied, and the Johnsons' cousins 5 together would have satisfied the requirement for their own school. Amazingly, school segregation continued to be the law of the land until 1883. Though the law appears in the 1887 recodification of Montana laws, it doesn't disappear from the Montana codes until 1895, the year before Plessy v. Ferguson established the separate but equal clause. Indeed, the late 1800s witnessed substantial violence, intimidation, discrimination, and after the turn of the century, Montana legislatures codified many of these practices. Post-Reconstruction Montana was a place of segregation, and other racist structures and practices characterized life in the territory. One particular incident took place in Butte in 1881 and resulted in the state Supreme Court case that invoked the 14th Amendment. The events were known as the Chop House Affair, and it's quite a scandal. So let's set the stage. William Woodcock was a well-known and well-liked resident of Helena. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1852 and arrived in Montana during the 1870s. He was a servant to Joshua Jacobs, who was stationed at Fort Shaw in the 1870s, so over Sun River area, Fort Shaw, Cascade County. And while he was in Jacobs' service, Woodcock participated as a civilian in the campaign for the Battle of the Big Hole in August of 1877. And there's quite an interesting write-up about his role in that. He was supposed to just stay on the sidelines, but he refused to do it. He was kind of very forced into the melee. But also William Woodcock married Teresa Lewis at the fort in 1878. And Jacobs and the young couple then moved with the 7th Infantry to Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and they appear there with their baby daughter, Blanche, in the 1880 census. But by 1881, he had returned to Montana, this time to Helena, where Woodcock got a job as a servant to Alexander Campbell Botkin. So there they are. It's so nice that we have a photograph of them. A prominent Republican, Botkin had been the United States Marshal for the Montana Territory since 1878. And in 1880, he lost use of his legs as the result of an illness following exposure during a winter storm. And he used a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. He remained active in the law and politics, though, and he rose to lieutenant governor in 1893. But here's what happened in 1881. According to Mr. Woodcock, and as told by the Butte Miner newspaper, on a September evening in 1881, Mr. Woodcock accompanied his employer, Mr. Botkin, to dinner with Botkin's brother, who was a druggist in Butte. And they entered the Virginia City Chop House, a popular establishment located near the corner of Broadway and Main in Butte. Unfortunately, the building is no longer standing, but we can see, so this is Broadway, and this is Park in Butte, and the Chop House, this is Main Street. The Chop House was up here on that corner. So the party enters the building, and the brothers took a seat at the table just to the right of the entrance. I feel like Oliver Stone. So they walk in and they sit at the table to the right of the entrance. But it was kind of one of those communal places where everybody kind of just filled in at the table they were sitting at. Kind of like the cafe in Dell. If you've been to the cafe in Dell, it's a great place. They still have communal seating, which is great. So anyway, they all kind of pile in. And Woodcock often sat next to Mr. Botkin to assist him during his meals. On this occasion, he took a seat at the nearest table because the Botkin's table was full. There was a young man already seated at the table who left the table, quote, with expressions of disgust. According to Mr. Woodcock, Mr. Fisk, the proprietor, then told the waiter to tell Woodcock to leave the table and that he would not be served a meal in the restaurant. Colonel Botkin asked Fisk, the manager, if there was any objection to Woodcock eating at his table. But Mr. Woodcock felt too aggrieved to eat and sat nearby waiting for the Botkin party to finish their meal. Fisk later on claimed that he only asked Woodcock to sit at a different table, which made Woodcock angry. But Botkin asked if Woodcock could eat with him, and Fisk said certainly, but Woodcock refused, saying, he would not eat in this damned house if he could not eat where he chose. Woodcock then filed a civil claim in the U.S. Court at Deer Lodge under the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, asking for $500 in damages because he had been denied equal privileges at the Chop House with white people. The district court decided in Woodcock's favor in December of 1883. He got his $500, which was great. This case is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First, of course, that in the discriminatory environs of Montana during the 1880s, the judge decided in his favor. It should have been big news, right? It should have been splashed across every newspaper. He won. It's great, but it wasn't. Newspapers didn't make a big deal of it at all. And one historian, Mr. Smurr, suggests that to do so would have encouraged others to sue, and that it risked the case going to territorial Supreme Court or even the U.S. Supreme Court, something whites wanted to avoid. As it was, the case made little difference in how black people were treated in Montana, and indeed, by the turn of the 20th century, things were only going to get worse. So a bit of follow-up, what happened to Mr. Woodcock, right? We don't want to know. He lived a very nice life here in Helena. He lived the rest of his life in Helena. He owned a carpet cleaning business. And his wife died in 1893 at the age of 34, but his wonderful daughters, Blanche, Jessie, and Alice, all lived in the community as well. His house was at 418 8th Avenue near Davis Street, so it's kind of right at that jog. You know the jog. And he apparently was a great storyteller. He held court to tell of his adventures in the Battle of the Big Hole, and he thought himself quite the fisherman, so he loved to tell a good fish tale. He died in 1901, just a year after, sadly, his house and his business burned down. So if you go to that corner, so 418, you know the yellow stucco house on the corner of Davis and 8th? It's got the lovely window boxes. You'll see it. You'll know it when you see it. So it's right across the street from that in the 400 block. There's a lovely historic house kind of in from the corner, and then there's a vacant lot. And as far as I can tell, that's the vacant lot where their house was, where the cleaning business was and where the family lived that burned down in 1900 and was never rebuilt, and I think it's still a vacant lot. But you can see it if you want to. Drive by, the little tour. But he did have a nice life, Mr. Woodcock did. So in her National Register of Historic Places document, African American Heritage Places, historian Delia Hagen explains, using quotes from other sources, that, quote, Woodcock's 1883 victory notwithstanding, discrimination in Montana continued to take both legal and illegal forms. Racism in the workplace relegated black people to low-waged, demanding jobs and kept them from and in certain industries. One of the largest employers of Montana was the Anaconda Company, right? And from its beginnings, the company, quote, did not hire black workers, period. During the 1894 Capitol fight, the Colored Citizen newspaper claimed that while Anaconda Company gave, quote, employment to thousands of men, not a single colored citizen can be found among them. Yea, even more, we learned that no N-word was allowed in our works, quote unquote, is the unanimous sentiment of those who control the company as well as those who are employed by the company. Helena had its share of Jim Crowism. Several black people who wrote into the Colored Citizen in 1894 complained of and exposed Helena's restaurant's refusal to serve them. As Helena native Norman Crump Howard recalled, racism thrived in this period. He said, quote, blacks faced together discrimination problems, tougher discrimination problems than Indians. They were excluded from nearly every restaurant in town and held low-paying jobs. And you better not go into a bar to drink. Such racism was no secret. In July 1908, the Montana Plain Dealer, which was another black newspaper published here in Helena for several years, and their offices were above the windbag, where the windbag is now. There's more to that building than just Big Dorothy. But the Plain Dealer reported that up at the head of Wall Street on Main is a little old, cheap, dirty restaurant which has the nerve to put up a sign, quote, no colored trade solicited. It seemed that unless a change was made, all these public eating houses would ban black people. Such discrimination extended to other public places as well. Perdita Duncan of Butte recalled, quote, you were just kept out of certain places, and by the time I was coming along, there was still just certain places I wouldn't go, and I just never bothered. In Billings, residents, including Eunice Terry, recalled that well into the 1950s, black residents weren't allowed to try on clothing in downtown department stores, sit anywhere in movie theaters, or swim in city pools unless the water would be cleaned the next day. There was a practice of discouraging minorities from buying property beyond certain areas of town. And so I've never seen in print any law that said only white people can buy in this neighborhood, but we certainly know that in practice that was the case, right? And so we have different neighborhoods. In Billings in particular, the South Side neighborhood really is where most of the black residents and Latino residents lived, rather than the white residents who were on the north side of the tracks. In Helena, there wasn't one particular neighborhood, certainly that kind of south central neighborhood around Rodney, right where we are, kind of up from here up to the fire tower, was a very diverse community, but there were also enclaves around the AME Church, which is kind of in that middle area between the Capitol and downtown. And then over by the Broadwater and across from Carroll College, there were certain families that worked either at Fort Harrison, and so they lived over by where the streetcar line would take you out to Fort Harrison. Or there were families that lived here and worked at the hotels downtown, so they were the folks that lived in this neighborhood. And then there was Mr. Dorsey, who had Dorsey's Grocery on 8th Avenue, and were just beloved family members. He died in 1904, and his wife, of course, ran that grocery, where the Wise Penny, you guys remember the Wise Penny? That's Dorsey's Grocery, was established by a black family here in Helena. So, but other places, you know, Missoula's north and west sides, there certainly were in practice. Great Falls, south side, again, were in practice pretty darn discriminatory when it came to where people were allowed to buy property. So during the first decades of the 20th century, the Montana legislature passed several Jim Crow laws intended to limit the rights of black people and other minority groups. For example, in 1907, a new law prohibited non-members of fraternal orders, how's this for specific, and other organizations, including the Elks, from wearing their organization's insignias in public. You weren't allowed to wear your Elks pin if it was a black fraternal organization. In 1908, Helena musician William Holland was found guilty of wearing his diamond Elks pin with its insignia on it to his wedding. He was arrested at his wedding for wearing the pin. Though Holland said that the pin's insignia indicated his membership in the African American Club, called the Improved Benevolent Protective Order of Elks of the World, the jury determined that the eye was too difficult to see on the pin, and people might assume that he was a regular elk, and that was not acceptable. The case went to the Montana Supreme Court, where the law was struck down as unconstitutional. Yay, Montana Supreme Court. The court held, quote, "The act is so obnoxious to the equal protection of the law clause of the 14th Amendment to the federal Constitution, and that further, a statute which distributes its burdens unequally upon those who occupy the same relation to its subjects, or punishes one citizen for doing that which another may do with impunity, or abridges the liberty of one without imposing the like restriction upon another, does not furnish the equal protection of laws guaranteed by Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the federal Constitution." So yay, Supreme Court. The ridiculous not wearing your fraternal pin law was actually struck down. And when researching that, I was like, who in the world came up with this idea, right? I mean, this is really specific. But apparently, it was kind of on a printing press, like it had been passed in several southern states. And somebody got wind of it and said, oh, that's a good idea. And they brought it out here and introduced it to the legislature. And the legislature said, sure. So I mean, this is serious. The man did go to jail and get fined and had to bring his case to court. But another very serious law that went into effect at this time was the law that disallowed marriages and cohabitation between white people and African Americans, Chinese, and Native American people. So the idea of banning interracial marriage in Montana began with the very first territorial legislature. In 1864, Idaho Territory disallowed those marriages, though the law allowed for marriages established before the law was in effect. So it was okay if you were already married, but you couldn't get married moving forward. When writing the Montana laws the same year, Representative A.E. Mayhew introduced Bill number 19, which mirrored the Idaho law. Though initially passed by the Judiciary Committee, Granville Stewart, our friend Granville Stewart again, who was married to a Native American woman named Albany Tukara Stewart, and other legislators rejected the bill on the third reading, sending it back to committee where it died. In 1866, a similar bill also failed. Although the bill failed to become law, interracial couples certainly experienced discrimination and even violence. In 1893, in Glenda, Montana, John Orr, a white man, married Emma Wall, a black woman. The mob of white residents surrounded the newly married couple, stripped off their clothes, painted John black using lamp black and Emma white using albastine, and paraded them through the town where they were jeered and suffered additional humiliations. The mob threatened them and ordered them to leave town within 24 hours. The anti-miscegenation issue rose again when Senator Charles F. Muffley, who lived in Winston, Montana, introduced Senate Bill 71 in the 1907 Montana legislature. This would have banned marriages between white people and African American, Chinese, Japanese, and Native American people. That one didn't pass, but in 1909, Muffley again introduced the similar bill, but this one did not include Native Americans in the list of banned spouses. After much debate and political maneuvering, the bill became law, and the Anti-Miscegenation Act of 1909 made it illegal for whites to marry or cohabitate with African American, Chinese, or Japanese people, and penalized those who performed such marriages. An example of how this impacted folks A woman named Maude Healy lived in Livingston, Montana. Her Irish husband, Thomas, had died by 1900, and she appears in the census living on South D Street with her 3 children, who also identified as Black in that 1900 census. In the next censuses, the family members are identified as mulatto and then subsequently as white. Interestingly, the children had white spouses, begging the question if they had rejected their African American heritage in exchange for their marriages to be legal. The Montana Supreme Court upheld the law in 1943's Takahashi estate case. Mr. Takahashi was born in Japan and moved to Montana in 1912. He married Vivian Barker in Spokane in 1915. And when he died in 1941, he was actually murdered, but he didn't have a will. The state refused to grant his wife standing in the probate proceedings. The court ruled that their marriage was void according to Montana state law. The Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs took an active role in lobbying for equal rights and non-discrimination laws at the state and local level. Their archives reveal their efforts to influence and encourage legislation to take up anti-discrimination bills. And in 1951, House Bill 58 sought to, quote, prohibit certain practices of discrimination by employers, employment agencies, labor organizations, and others because of race, color, creed, national origin, or ancestry, creating a Montana Fair Employment Practices Commission, defining its functions, powers, and duties, providing for its procedure, and enforcement and judicial review, imposing penalties. The bill lost on the floor for the vote with a vote of 32 in favor and 43 against. Also in 1951, the legislature considered a bill to guarantee full and equal enjoyment of all places of public accommodation, but that didn't pass. In 1955, the Anti-Discrimination Accommodation Law, very similar to the 1951's law, did pass, though virtually all of the original language and all of the penalties for noncompliance were stripped for the final version. So it was against the law, but if you did it, there was no penalty. They weren't allowed to arrest you. They weren't even allowed to fine you. So, of course, the practice continued. As we've seen, the discrimination and accommodations continued well after the law went into effect and continues today. And let me look. I probably don't have time, but I'm going to just tell you how to get to. We actually, as part of our African American History website, we have a story map that identifies all of those places in Montana that advertised in the Green Book. So as you know, the Green Book was a travel guide for Black travelers for safe haven. The first entry from Montana was in the 1930s, one of the very first Green Books. A lady who ran a boarding house right across the street over here. You know where the parking lot is, the lower parking lot for Reader's Alley? Her boarding house was right in there, and she advertised in the Green Book for people that it was a safe place to stay. And there were other, by the late 1950s, after this accommodation law was passed, more people started advertising in the Green Book from mid-50s through the 60s, until, of course, the Civil Rights Act, in theory, made the Green Book irrelevant. Of course, we know that that's not true, but that's what they did. So for more information about accommodations in Montana that catered to Black tourists, you can find more information on our website. So various groups, including the League of Women Voters, included African American members and worked on a number of issues, including equal rights, fair housing, and social justice through the 1960s and 1970s. These issues were addressed at the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. While the Constitution did not include an Equal Rights Amendment, Article 2 section does declare the dignity of the human being is inviolable. No person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws. Neither the state nor any person, firm, corporation, or institution shall discriminate against any person in the exercise of his civil or political rights on account of race, color, sex, culture, social origin, or condition, or political or religious ideas. 1972 Montana Constitution. It's a great document. Geraldine, oh, there's our League of Women Voters folks and the ladies of the Con-Con. Geraldine Travis represented Great Falls in the Montana House of Representatives in the 1975 session. She moved to Great Falls as part of with her husband, and they lived on Malmstrom Air Force Base. And so she was elected from that district, and she was only in the legislature for one session, and then moved on to and lives in Arizona now, but she's still living. But as we stand here, she is the only person of African American descent to serve in the Montana legislature to date. But she's certainly an amazing lady. So I would encourage you to please take a look at the Historical Society website. If you are able, please go to the Montana PBS on Monday night at 8 p.m. on the 13th of February. They'll be airing Hidden Stories, Montana's Black Past, which is an overview of Montana's Black history, not just the legislative part. Follows several African-American families, multi-generational African-American families from Montana, and goes from our buddy York with the Lewis and Clark expedition all the way through present day. Talks about the establishment of the African-American Studies program, which was the second in the country in the 1968 at the University of Montana. So big topic. Lots to discuss, but it turned out really well, and we're really pleased with it. And it'll also stream on Montana PBS if you're interested. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about Montanans over the generations, and I'm looking forward to any of your questions, and that's my presentation. Thanks.
So are there any questions?
You spoke about the segregated housing and mentioned that that was not a legal requirement. Was there redlining by financial institutions or restrictive covenants that enforce this?
Thank you. So the question's about redlining and restrictive covenants, and the answer is absolutely. While I haven't found a redline map, the policy, the federal policy for loan giving, specifically after the war and during mid-20th century, and then especially after the war, was very discriminatory. And while there wasn't a red line map that I have found in the state of Montana, the thresholds and the requirements for getting a federal loan were inherently discriminatory. But as far as codes or kind of rules for neighborhoods, yes, there were absolutely those rules that were in many Montana communities. There were also several what we call sundown towns in Montana that wouldn't necessarily, they didn't advertise it. Well, one did. But places like Hardin, there are a couple of Roundup. But those sundown towns were basically nobody of African-American descent was allowed on the streets after sundown. If they were there, they were arrested. But that's kind of the national definition. In Montana, it really applied to Native American people more than African-American people. But those laws certainly were in place, if not at the local level, in people's minds and hearts. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question. The picture you had of the Duncan woman, is she related to Joan Duncan?
She is. She's her sister. So there's Joan. Joan actually was really generous and gave us an oral history. We wrote a history of the Duncan house, her dad's house in Butte, and she went through it and confirmed and told us great stories about living up in that house in Butte, which is great. Her dad was a podiatrist, and they had Perdita is her aunt. Perdita was Walter Duncan's sister. So the next one up, but yes, same family. Same family. And the Duncans married the drivers, who married the Mundys, everybody. It's such a huge family. They're just absolutely wonderful. And they were really, really generous with this project. Kathy?
So have you learned everything that there is to know, or is there still more research?
Oh my heavens, when we did this movie, we thought it's going to be 10 minutes and we're just going to introduce the idea and lead people to learn more at the website. That was the whole idea. It ended up being 60 minutes, and we discovered along the way that we could do many, many episodes, and that's hopefully maybe one day, but there's so much more to learn, because Montana history is Black at the roots, right? Black history is Montana history. It's part of every aspect of Montana history.
I was wondering, the legislature in session right now, just if there are still discriminatory laws on the books that just kind of get passed by, or if they've been cleaned up.
Well, there are several more recent laws that people are working on to make sure that, that I'm sure there's something on the books. For example, it's still okay to enslave people if it's punishment for a crime. That hasn't it doesn't appear in our Constitution, but it also hasn't been explicitly said, no, that's not what we're going for here in Montana. So that's actually still on the books, which isn't necessarily for African Americans, but it's certainly a legacy from the slavery period that's still there. But the Montana Human Rights Act, there's been several pieces of legislation that, in recent years, that don't allow for hate crimes, that there's extra punishment for hate crimes, there's extra protections. Certainly that's in law, but not necessarily in practice across the state.
At one point, there were African-American soldiers stationed in Missoula who rode bicycles to St. Louis.
Yes.
And when I was a student at the University of Montana, some of the students in the African-American Studies program commemorated that ride by riding. Do you have a copy of their video at the Historical Society? Because a lot of people have asked me if there's a place where they could see it.
It's actually housed at they have a copy at the museum at Fort Missoula, and I believe they have put it up on YouTube. So I believe you can watch it. And they just commemorated it again this summer and did another brand new ride from Missoula to St. Louis to celebrate that remarkable achievement. Those bicycles, they just didn't catch on though. Too many prickly pear popped the tires. And those bikes weighed like 50 pounds. I felt bad. They said the person that had the worst job of the whole thing was the mechanic, who had to ride all day and then stay up all night to fix the bikes so that they could move on in the morning. Yeah, there's some wonderful photographs too of them. I love there's the photograph of the bicyclists on terribly environmentally irresponsible, actually standing with their bikes on the Mammoth Springs. Yeah. Yeah, it's not good.
It's a postcard.
Right, it's a nice picture postcard, but don't encourage it.
So will a book be coming out with this research?
Well, actually, Anthony's book, Black Montana, just came out, and he's been working with the Historical Society. He came on, good old Anthony. He's a rock star. He's originally from Anaconda, went to Carroll College, started as an intern with us on the Black History Project when he was a junior in college at Carroll. Graduated from Carroll, got his master's degree at the history department, focusing on Black history in the West from from MSU, and now he is finishing his PhD at the University of Michigan in Black history in the West. And he's written this amazing book called Black Montana that's really just a wonderful, fulfilling thing. There's also part of this project, one of the big emphases was, I work at the State Historic Preservation Office, so we're about building in place, right, and place-based history. And Delia Hagen wrote a statewide historic context about Black history. It's available on our website, and I can share it with anybody who wants. If we have your email addresses, we can certainly email it to you if you want. But it's the first kind of comprehensive statewide narrative history about Black history. And we just found out it won the National Council on Public History Award for the best public history document this year. So we're really excited about that.
Well, Kate, thank you so much. And we will not be emailing you Delia Hagen's thing because I don't know who wants it. But if you do want it, you can email us. Email Kate Hampton at khampton@mt.gov. And I hope you'll join us on February 23rd for Liz Gunderson. Dr. Gunderson is going to be speaking about the invention of the Holter heart monitor and remembering Bill Glasscock. So here, February 23rd at 6:30. So thank you for coming, and thank you so much for Kate.
You're welcome.